the American Republic. When did it stop being a republic? Have you had thoughts on this, Germanicus?
Taking it from a scene toward the end of the movie, Sixth Sense, my response would be every day. Every day, one is forced to consider what America has become and how much longer it can be the America that our ancestors had conceived.
This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm Gaius. Germanicus is here. We're in Londinium. It's overcast. We had snow in London these last days. Very odd for this time of year coming spring. However, we are in Londinium. We're very far from Rome, and that's warm any time we want it to be, since we do not have to worry about the walls having ears. We're at our favorite wine bar, our second cup of wine. The Centurions have gone on home, and we're going to the theater later. The Terence plays are still in town. They're very good at it. They've had encores, and our actors are attentive to our needs here in Londinium. We don't see professional theaters like theirs often, and we usually have to deal with the Greek stuff, all lessons learned. Whereas Terence and his comedians, we always know it ends in a marriage ceremony. It's always wonderful. However, we have much business to attend to, and Germanicus is here to deal with headlines from the 21st century. There's no change in here in the first. Domitian's still in trouble with the Senate, and there will be a better day coming. But in the 21st century, the situation is productive. That was the word used. Okay, here we go. The headline, BBC. This is London reporting. The BBC is not a non-player here. It has a purpose. The picture's from Reuters, but the headlines are BBC. U.S. Special Envoy meets Putin as Trump urges Russia to, quote, get moving on Ukraine ceasefire. Dateline in the last 24 hours. U.S. Envoy Steve Witkoff met Vladimir Putin in Petersburg on Friday as Donald Trump urged the Russian president to get moving. The Kremlin said the meeting lasted for more than 4 hours and focused on, quote, aspects of a Ukrainian settlement, end quote. The meeting, Witkoff's third with Putin this year, was described by Special Envoy Kirill Dmitriev. That is a Russian central banker. He runs the Sovereign Wealth Fund. He works directly for Putin. Kirill Dmitriev, who was in Washington 2 weeks ago to speak to the president directly. So these are their two envoys. Dmitriev to Trump and Witkoff to Putin, described the meeting as, quote, productive. The Trump has expressed frustration over the progress of talks. It comes as Trump's Ukraine envoy, Keith Kellogg, denied, suggesting the country could be partitioned. There you are, Germanicus, just the way you told us it was going to go. Russia and the U.S. are dividing up Ukraine, and they're bypassing this word ceasefire, and they're going for a big settlement that has to do with the development of Russia's economy after 3 years of war and the sanctions. Are you pleased? Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. I have not been pleased since this war began. And that really goes back to the Maidan demonstrations and all of the terrors that have issued forth since. And the fact is that, the nation of Ukraine has been destroyed. Now it will effectively be partitioned. It already has been. And whether the partition will go further than what we see today as the battle lines remains to be seen. My sense is that it will go beyond that, but how much further, I don't know. And the fact is that Ukraine is a riven, ruined country, in large part thanks to the U.S. and Europe, or the minions of the U.S., I should say, because of their NATO expansionism. And that was driven by the calling, the mission of the U.S. to spread democracy across the world, even if it meant a war between Russia and Ukraine. So that has been settled in the sense that the US and its vision of a world order has been stopped. It's been brought to a crashing halt in Ukraine. And so this war that the US has waged with its European minions against Russia is effectively over. It has been for some time. The best thing about Mr. Trump as a strategist, or at least a budding strategist, is that he recognizes that there's nowhere to go and that this thing should be brought to an end. And by wanting to embrace Russia in a new relationship, he actually is, I think, deeply aware of the benefits that a new kind of set of understandings can bring the US. In other words, if the US is no longer to feel unrestrained in promoting a world order that it is the sole leader of and is willing to prosecute wars anywhere on the planet in order to make sure that happens and to make sure that that world order, that world peace, quote unquote, is sustained, is over. And the wars that the US has waged and is still waging through proxies is potentially coming to an end. If it does, the world will be better for it. But Trump, as president, is very well aware that the war can't simply end as a defeat for the US. It can result as a defeat for NATO because I think the US is beginning to detach itself from Europe. But it cannot be a defeat for the US. And so, in the larger scheme of things, in the larger compass or orbit of the US moving ahead in a positive way, I think that having a relationship with Russia is one way to change the terms, to reframe the conversation. So it isn't that Russia must lose for the US to win. It's now a situation where we're putting that behind us. A settlement will allow the US to engage in a renewed relationship, not a reset, as Hillary Clinton once said, but rather a new way forward. And that puts that puts the entire past 10 years behind us in a way that doesn't look like a defeat. And I think when it comes to things that have looked wholly extraneous and crazy to Americans, like the whole contretemps over Panama and Greenland, is actually, and we've raised this in weeks past, it's a way to also uh, cement this reframing of what the U.S. is all about by focusing on the traditional areas of the American realm, of the American, if you will, empire, and to do so in ways that make us withdrawing from feckless imperial adventures look like a positive thing, because we're not retreating, we're moving in new directions. And these new directions, of course, completely distract the attention from what has been a defeat which was the entirely the doing of the last administration.
Details since we last talked, Germanicus, there was a report from Germany
Mm-hmm.
that in the most recent poll, which is a week Sunday, the day we talked, but the results were later that day and the next day,
Right.
in which Alternative for Deutschland outpolled CSU, CDU, the winners of the most recent election, rocking the coalition as it forms between the CDU, the Christian
Yeah.
Democrats, and Friedrich Merz, and the Social Democrats. Olaf Schultz no longer leads it, but the same demand of welfare. And the AfD outpolled them both. Now, I mention that because if the U.S. is to back away from NATO, even stay in NATO but not lead anymore, Germany's the engine that they have to look to.
Yeah.
And it looks in doubt how long that engine could last, given that AfD, doing nothing, gain in popularity.
The U.S. Retreat from its longstanding, since 1949, really since 1945, dominance, rule even over Europe is a very good thing. And it's a good thing for Europe because in a situation where it has been established, as Mr. Vance did in his turbulent trip and his speech to European leaders, he essentially demarcated the differences between the US and Europe. And in many ways, that was a very positive thing, not just for the US being able to slough off the the baggage of Europe strategically, but also for Europeans, and especially for European populist movements that seek to create a kind of new democracy, because democracy really doesn't exist in the kind of plutocratic, oligarchic, elite run world that is the European Union. And for the US to be involved in anything like European electoral outcomes would tend to screw all of these populist movements. So for us to be removed from that really liberates them. And the fact that Europe needs to stand on its own 2 feet also exposes the legacy of pusillanimity and the groveling approach to the U.S. in contrast to the kind of dictatorial or at least authoritarian hand that they've dealt to European societies. And now it's a situation where the AfD and Marie Le Pen's movement and others, like in Britain, are free to express themselves and basically to represent themselves as being the better leaders, not just because they have popular support, but also they're willing to move ahead and move out in the direction of European, not independence, but standing on their own. So, in other words, the U.S. pulling away from Europe actually is a way to indirectly enable populist movements to more powerfully represent themselves as being not just the authentic voice of European societies, but in contrast to the failed policies, the reckless, stupid, vassal-like, submissive policies on one hand, and yet aggressive toward Russia on the other hand, to say, hey, let's wipe the slate clean. We can create a defense framework for ourselves that will secure European security for the future.
We've attended to Europe. We're headed to the Pacific. In the Pacific right now, there's a trade war underway between the United States and China. There are other details here, but I'm not going to overwhelm with numbers. I'm just going to say it's two big dogs gonna fight time from Dr. Strangelove. And the two big dogs right now are fighting with rhetoric. The question is, have we seen this before? Now, being Romans, we were educated into the successes of the Roman Republic before it became a really good idea, the Roman Empire, which we live in. But we get sentimental about our educations growing up here in Londinium, far away from Rome. Remember, we're not vulnerable to the Roman intrigues because we're, several weeks away by even the good roads we've built. And therefore, we'd have time to prepare our defenses if somebody denounced us. But they won't, because all the Greeks we employ, they do all the work. We pay well, and they know that if they informed on us, you'd lose a good payday. So Germanicus and I are comfortable enough to go to an analogy of what we see in the 21st century. Germanicus, once upon a time, Carthago delenda est. Carthage was founded by, we're told, the Phoenicians. It was a trading city, the new city. And it survived while the originals fell to the intrigues and the vicissitudes and the Black Swan events of the Levant. But Carthage became a rival for the major powers in the Italian peninsula. First Syracuse, Carthage versus Syracuse, and Carthage won that one. Otherwise, Syracuse would have continued to become powerful from the 4th century BCE. And then Rome. Rome knew or believed early on that in order to triumph, it wasn't enough to own the Italian peninsula. We had to very carefully maneuver so that we not just dealt with Carthage, we dominated and destroyed it. Carthago delenda est. I tell the story quickly because I want to know if you're comfortable with the idea that Washington versus Beijing reminds we Roman citizens of Rome versus Carthage in the 2nd century BCE.
It may, it might. And certainly the US is in a position not dissimilar to that of Rome in, let us say, the beginning of the late 200s BC, in the sense that Rome is not fully established, and a war with Carthage is a way to begin to consolidate its rule over all of Italy. And in effect, the 150-year struggle with Carthage was the path whereby Rome achieved its dominance over at least the Western Mediterranean. It would do so over the Greek East a bit later. But this period from around 280 to 130 BC was in a series of wars, three specifically, which destroyed Carthage, but allowed Rome to essentially not just exert dominance over the larger space of the Mediterranean, but also it consolidated its rule over Italy as well. And the US today is not that similar to Rome, but at the same time, the confrontation has some kind of eerie resonance in the sense that a long-standing competition, you could call it a struggle, with China could, in a sense, help to consolidate America, an America that's somewhat lost its way during this evanescent short period of U.S. world power, world leadership, as they call it in Washington. But essentially, the unipolar moment is over. And for the U.S. to find its way, conflict with China would kind of cement that. But it's a dicey proposition, and for several reasons. One, the U.S. is not configured for actual war as opposed to Rome. Rome was configured literally for nothing else except war. That's one of the reasons that Rome succeeded the way it did. On the other hand, I mean, the U.S. is in a position where it wants to create some sort of outcome vis-a-vis China where benefits accrue to the U.S. and they're mostly a search for economic benefits, and that might be realizable if China wishes to do so. And China is not necessarily in a strong position as, surface indicators might seem to indicate. China has deep internal weaknesses economically, and its system has fragilities that are not acknowledged, obviously, but also not necessarily visible. You have to look for them. And for the US to confront China puts China in a very shaky position, which I think would tend to suggest that the US and China could come to a rapprochement, and any kind of symbolic, even ephemeral outcome that allows the current US administration to say, well, we've righted some historic economic imbalances, and this will open the way for the US to prosper. And it shows the US is still number one in the sense that it has the clout to move a rival. That would be great. On the other hand, China may not feel it can yield and give up its own search for equality with the U.S., a kind of um, not primacy, but certainly primacy in East Asia. And so my sense is that the whole China-U.S. Contretemps is solvable, but it will require accommodation on both sides. And I don't know what level of give there is in either China or the U.S. And it needs to be re restated or underscored that the U.S. and China have entered into this kind of more visible confrontation only recently, just now, in effect, with the trade tariff war, quote unquote. And we don't know where that's going, but my sense is that China is weak in ways that it doesn't acknowledge economically and in terms of its system. And the US is weak militarily. It doesn't have the kind of strength to assert anything in the Western Pacific. And it's also divided politically and not necessarily in the most stable situation either. So you have two unstable regimes that know that war, actual war, would be devastating and would bring them both down.
Is trade war enough?
The trade war is a hortatory war. It is
Well,
a,
that was the period that vast century plus you named. There was competition the whole time.
yes, and Mr. Trump levied tariffs on China during his first term, and so I would suggest that this is kind of picking up where his first term left off, and it's a kind of continuation struggle. And uh,
So you
my,
think coexistence is real.
pardon me.
You see coexistence as genuine.
I think that there's no alternative but for China and the US to coexist. The question is, what are the terms of the relationship? And I think whatever the struggle is, and however superficial or titular that struggle is, it is all going to focus on coming to an understanding of what each side has to give in order to make it work. Because for it not to work would be a catastrophe for the world as a whole, and specifically for China and the US in particular. And I think both sides are aware of that. So I think this is an elegant sort of game that will be played out, and it will be played out over the next year or two, and hopefully it'll be resolved earlier than that. I don't see China or the US as being traditional great powers, certainly not in the mold of Carthage and Rome, because both Carthage and Rome in that period in the 280s were flexing powers. They had things they wanted, and they were willing to go to war to get them. And the fact that they had, both Rome and Carthage, such great military potential, and that they both performed so over the top. I mean, Carthage overperformed in the Second Punic War, and Rome was able to win, but it was a close run thing. And the fact that they both had the capacity to take it to the limit meant that they would take it to the limit. And I think the overall awareness in the US and China today is that the limit, the threshold is so close and so easily breached that they can't push it too far. I mean, and I really do believe that. So my sense is that this will continue until some kind of mutual accommodation is reached.
And a detail about the original. The Romans destroyed Carthage and then rebuilt it some years later.
Right.
And it fell again and rebuilt it some years later. The ruins of Carthage are spectacular. I've never been there, but I've watched that develop over 150 years. It was a beautiful, workmanlike trade city. It,
Hmm.
it was as close to a city designed to be top of the line capitalism as you can imagine before in BCE times. It was arranged. That harbor of theirs was magical. It must have
Oh,
been
it was.
one
It
of the
was.
wonders of the world.
And when Rome finally destroyed Carthage and then rebuilt it, the Novo Carthago was a bustling place for the next 800 years. Roman, but it was Carthage.
I'm Gaius. Germanicus is here, and we're on our way to the theater, sacrificing before we reach the theater to our god Augustus, the emperor. And it is useful to name the emperor because the republic stopped when Augustus rose up over his rivals, but Marcus Aurelius was the last one. Mark Antony was the last one. So we can sort of date the rise of the empire and the fall of the republic somewhere in that period between 30 BCE and 25 BCE, somewhere in there. Now, is that useful to look at the American Republic and ask, when did it stop being a republic, if it has, and what are we watching for? Have you had thoughts on this, Germanicus?
Taking it from a scene toward the end of the movie, Sixth Sense, my response would be every day, quote unquote. Every day, one is forced to consider what America has become and how much longer it can be the America that our ancestors had conceived. And the thing about the Roman Republic is that it was the people who were the stewards and guardians of the Republic that brought the Republic down. The Republic wasn't brought down by outside agents or an enemy power, or even by uh, traitors within who schemed and conspired to bring it down. It was brought down by its own pillars, by those men who were the stainless upholders, supposedly, of the Republic. They created a concatenation of blows that were delivered from the period of the Gracchi brothers all the way down, as you mentioned, to the Battle of Actium. And it took a long time. It took 100 years to bring it down. And the US has been suffering as a republic for decades. And I would say the decades are, well, I'd say since sometime after the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, because we begin to get indicators of the republic's fragility and its susceptibility to um, other forms of power, with the assassination of John F. Kennedy, then on to Watergate. Then you see it reemerge in recent decades. And frankly, like Rome, one of the larger external forces bringing down the Roman Republic was Rome's triumph, paradoxically. When it triumphed over all enemies in the Mediterranean and was the lord, effectively, in military terms, of the Mediterranean, after, I'd say 197 BC, the Battle of Cynocephali. Rome was the dominant force, and Rome became um, a power that created um, elements within the system that brought it down. In other words, to be the military power that dominated the known world, the Mediterranean world, it had to develop institutional forms and centers of power that were in and of themselves inimical to Republican form of government. And the difficulty for the United States is that after 1945, we had to create institutional forms and powerful agencies, a gigantic military, for example, the CIA, the FBI, the so-called deep state, all of these forms, which were required to run a world system and sustain it and defend it, were also in their own way inimical to a republic of free citizens. And this has come to roost now, and it's being fueled. That is to say, the coming to roost, the unraveling of the republic, is being fueled by our increasing sudden awareness of the corruption that has preceded this moment of crisis, meaning going back to the Kennedy administration, Watergate, all of the things that were not under the aegis of Republican government, all of the powers that were uncontrolled of the deep state and the military industrial complex are now surfacing. And what that does is it undermines a public belief and trust and confidence that the republic even exists.
Do you find it significant that this saying they have everywhere? I see this: democracy, democracy, democracy. Democracy dies in darkness. It's everywhere. You've got to defend democracy, a blow to democracy. Do they know they have a republic? Because you can give up something you don't know you have very easily.
The emergence of these tropes, democracy dies in darkness,
They
our
don't have a
democracy,
democracy. They have a
those,
republic.
those are a conscious replacement a changeling effort to replace the republic as the center of our
So it's
constitutional
purposeful.
order
It's
with something squishy that has no meaning, which is what democracy is.
all right, but you're saying it's purposeful. It's not ignorant.
Yes, it's purposeful. It's purposeful because the people that have been in power for the last 20 years realize that for them to continue to hold power, they cannot be beholden to a Republican form of government any longer. And so they seek to swap that out for a an amorphous, resonant, promissory phrase that means nothing.
When did we stop being a republic? And I think you're saying yesterday.
Yesterday, many yesterdays. It is a slow, accretive process. When did World War II end? It's a long process. When
All
did the Roman Republic end? It did not end
right.
in 133 BC. It did not end with the death of Marius. It did not end with the intervention of Sulla. It did not even end with the assassination of Caesar. But every point along the way of the unraveling, it became more and more clear that this was to be the fate of the Republic. And that is the same for our Republic.
Democracy dies in darkness. It makes me smile every time I read it. Uh, I'm thinking to myself, well, all right, fine. That tells me they don't know what they have, but you're saying they do know what they have and they got rid of it. Okay.
Democracy dies publicly in the full blazing sunlight.
It's a republic. All right. We'll be the only Romans who apparently are aware of the fact that they're
Oh,
built their institutions on the shoulders of ours, and we work better as an empire than we did as a republic. Always. We lasted 1,500 years in some fashion as an empire.
yes. Well, the only way that some of the virtues of Rome could be retained would be to go to an imperial system. And the great concern now is that that may be true as well for this United States.
If they're lucky. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. Gaius is me, John Batchelor. We're headed to Augustus, our emperor, and he looks over us. He built an apparatus that survived Nero, and that's a genius.
Wow.
We're going on to see a comedy in which I could do the plot. I do the plot every night in my head. The favored son falls in love with a girl who's enslaved, who sings. And the next door neighbor has a son who falls in love with the right girl, the one that our hero is supposed to be marrying.
Mm.
In the end, it works out because, well, it must be a comedy. And so everybody marries correctly, and the fathers come to accept the future. And we Romans find that funny because we're surrounded by things that don't work out. And
Well, even 20th century Americans would recreate that wonderful context with a funny thing happened on the way to the
right,
forum.
right. They call them rom-coms, I think. Yes. Germanicus, Gaius, Londinium. Thank you.